Welcome to this episode of the Scottish History Podcast. I'm Chris.
And I'm Peter. This episode is part 2 of a 2-part series in Scottish trading history. In this episode, we're going all the way to China to talk about how Scots were drawn into the 19th century tea and opium trade.
The flow of people out of Scotland is an important aspect of Scottish history. As far back as the 1600s, Scots were known around Europe as being mobile. The scale of people moving from Scotland and the objectives of the Scots immigrants would change according to the time and according to the destination considered. There are lots of different chapters in the immigration story. The Chinese story is one of the more far-flung of them. By 1832, Scots were being pulled into the value chains of trade in Asia. At the end of that value chain, supplying a commodity in massive demand back in the European world, was China. Tea leaf, grown in southern China, stored in porcelain containers to keep the flavor intact, would travel to Europe under the flag of national institutions like the East India Company. It's through institutions like this that Scots would claim a robust space in Eastern commerce. Within that space, the production, transportation, and sale of what is still a dangerous and controversial crop, opium, would turn out to be a key product for making trade with China possible. If you were a Scot in 1800, looking to build a career trading in India and China, the East India Company was the only legal bridge for getting there. The East India Company was a trading company that had a royal decree to pursue British trading interests in Southeast Asia. And in this time, they started around the 1600s, and from the 1600s forward, lots of different national companies were formed. And each company would be given a certain geographical area that they would specialize in. So you had like the Dutch East India Company, and there was even a Danish East India Company and a Swedish one. And then countries had different specialized companies. So for Britain, there was the East India. The East India Company started as an English trading company. So you had the East India Company, the English East India Company trading in India and the East Indies. But you also had the Hudson Bay Company, which was focused on Canada, trading in furs. Scotland had its own company too, and it was started in the late 1600s. Scotland kind of arrived late in the game, and their company was called the Company of Scotland, trading to Africa and the Indies. Across the 1700s, the East India Company would find itself increasingly influential in the Indian subcontinent. There are lots of theories on why this happened, but one important part of this was that the domestic Mughal Empire, which had ruled India, had begun collapsing, and so more and more power and responsibility started to concentrate around the East India Company in India. So by 1800, much of the Indian subcontinent was being governed by a private company chartered by the British government. Beyond India, the East India Company would maintain even more distant trading stations with Indonesia, and at Canton in China. Running the East India Company opened up all kinds of opportunities for people who had access to the organization. But in 1700, prior to political union with England, Scots were not permitted to work in the company in large numbers. But after union in 1707, a key political barrier was withdrawn, and Scots could now talk, talent, and patronage their way into the East India Company. What has been described by historians as a flood of Scots then surged into the East India Company as soldiers, sailors, bureaucrats, doctors, and merchants. 2 Scots in particular would enter the East India Company and end up being especially successful: James Matheson and William Jardine. Their stories illustrate some of the significant parts which combined to propel the ambitious out of Scotland and into Asia. We'll look at 2 ideas just now. First one is the impact of what we're calling the East India Company apprenticeship, and the other one is the role of family networks. William Jardine entered the East India Company as a ship's surgeon after graduating from Edinburgh University. He would spend 15 years in that service, traveling with cargoes between Europe and China. On these trips, he developed a network of acquaintances with people involved in the trade, providing perspective on how trade with the East worked. As an East India Company employee, he was also given something called a privileged cargo space. This privilege was an allotment of the ship's cargo capacity, which the employee could sell as he wished. This would have stacked another layer of experience onto Jardine's skill set. James Matheson also worked through the East India Company. but in his case he entered as a private merchant, working in an agency house. The opportunity had arisen through family contacts, as it was for many people who entered the trade. The Mathesons had been active in the East India Company for some time, and the director of the agency house he started in was his uncle. Matheson and Jardine's stories rhyme with the findings of modern historians. Research into the staff records of the East India Company have reflected an overrepresentation of Scots. By 1800, while comprising about 10% of the British population, Scots had worked their way into a range of opportunities presented by the East India Company. So we have statistics like Scots comprised around 22% of the highest level civil servants in the company. They were around 56% of the surgeons and around 75% of the officer corps. They also comprised a disproportionate number of the private traders which were operating in China.
British trade with China revolved around a few key commodities. Silk, porcelain, and above all tea were being shipped out of China, where upon arrival in Europe it soaked up whatever spare money Europeans felt it deserved, which turned out to be a lot. Tea was light, high value, it was enjoyed by people of all classes. Described as the world's first mass-market consumer good, the great-great-great-grandmother of things like candy bars and Game Boys. The tap through which Europeans gained access to the tea was in the south of China, through the Pearl River and its port city of Canton, far from the centre of imperial authority in Peking, what we know as Beijing today. By 1830, an annual fleet of East India Company ships at harbour in Canton could hold anything from 20 to 30 million tons of Chinese tea for export into the European world. To fill up these ships with tea, Europeans had to abide by a wide range of convoluted rules created by the Chinese. These regulations restricted foreign trade to 3 port cities in southern China, with the port of Canton, now called Guangzhou, being the most significant. The system was put in place in 1757 as a response by the Chinese authorities to the growing number of Western traders, diplomats, and missionaries that were arriving. Europeans wanting to trade in China would have to jump through bureaucratic hoops. Now, these came in the form of what the Chinese called the 5 countermeasures against the barbarians, and these are really interesting, so they're as follows. 1. Trade by foreign barbarians in Canton is prohibited during winter. 2. Foreign barbarians coming to the city must reside in the foreign factories under the supervision and control of the Hong. Now, the Hong were the Chinese merchants in charge of enforcing these rules. 3. Chinese citizens are barred from borrowing capital from foreign barbarians and from employment by them. 4. Chinese citizens must not attempt to gain information on the current market situation from foreign barbarians. 5. Inbound foreign barbarian vessels must anchor in the Whampoa roads and await inspection by the authorities. Essentially, the goal of the Hong was to extract as much tax from trade as they could. So, for example, the East India Company paid £20,000 per annum in tax for their trading rights in Canton. The Hong were then in turn extorted by the Qing officials known as mandarins. As you can imagine, European traders weren't best pleased with this system. We have a quote from William Jardine describing it. Quote, Great Britain can never derive any important advantage from the opening of trade to China while a present mode of levying and extorting money from the Hong merchants exists. We must have a code with these celestial barbarians before we can extend advantageously our now limited commercial operations. We have a right to demand an equitable commercial treaty, so say we residents, but I am afraid that our friends at home will differ from us. End quote. The European merchants in Canton were restricted to what were called the factories. There were 13, each for a different company, so like the Spanish and the Dutch and the Americans, they all had their own factory. These were crammed into just 300 yards of coastline. Also, foreign merchants were forced to walk everywhere since it was illegal to hire or be offered a sedan share. It sounds like quite an unfriendly place for anyone that wasn't Chinese. A Scottish visitor to Canton described the place like this, quote, The whole place teems with speculation, with shopkeepers, barbers, quacks, thieves, rogues, vagabonds, and coolies, with fruit sellers and freak shows, layabouts catching lice from the folds of their clothing and cracking them between their teeth, with beggars and malnourished children, with foreigners shouting orders to Cantonese sailors or yelling for their servants. End quote. The claustrophobic feel made Lord Auckland, the future governor of India, say this about Canton. Quote, perhaps the most least pleasant residence for a European on the face of the earth. End quote. There was a lack of respect between Westerners and the Chinese, shown quite clearly here by James Matheson. He stated that the Chinese were, quote, a people characterized by a marvelous degree of imbecility, avarice, conceit, and obstinacy, to exhibit a spirit of exclusiveness on a grand scale. End quote. Seemingly, they only tolerated each other for the sake of the trade, and above all, the money.
Yeah, so it wouldn't have been a very pleasant place to work. You've sailed all the way from Europe to get here, and then you show up.
Yeah,
you're already. You can't relax.
Yeah, you can't relax. You got 300.
Welcome to China. We're glad that you want to buy our tea. If you could just sort of stay in this like 300 yards of coastline in these buildings, you can't leave that. Yeah. You got to stay there.
That's if you got off the ship, because you can't sail your ship into Canton. You have to anchor it outside of Canton and have the Chinese guide you in.
Mm-hmm.
Your hand was held every step of the way.
Yeah, so you have two options. You can either sit on your ship, which is probably not that nice, or you can stay in these factories, which would have been probably kind of unpleasant as well.
Mm-hmm.
The place to be in Canton was, not in Canton, but nearby there was the Portuguese colony, Macau.
Mm-hmm.
That was the place to be, because I think it was like Portuguese law kind of was more prevalent there, and so like you could have your family there, and you could, you just had more freedom. The East India Company fleet would arrive to and depart from Canton with the seasons, arriving in the summer, and as the winter monsoon winds arrived, setting off southeast for India and eventually to Europe's tea, silk, and porcelain markets. Ideally, they would have left behind a range of European goods in exchange for the tea. Common British exports of the time were things like cotton, textiles, or consumer goods which struck a chord with the Chinese. Unfortunately for East India Company merchants and British business generally, the Chinese market simply wasn't interested in most of the products that Europe could offer. Or as the Qing Emperor put it in 1792, quote, our celestial empire possesses all things in prolific abundance and lacks no product within its borders. There is, therefore, no need to import the manufactures of outside barbarians in exchange for our own produce. The best the East India Company could do was raw Indian cotton, and the Chinese had been importing this from India for centuries before the East India Company charter was even an idea. Some European gadgets like clocks were popular. The Chinese called these sing-songs, but nowhere near at the scale to pay for millions of tons of tea. The answer to this problem changed dramatically from 1800 to 1830. In 1800, the answer was to pay for tea with cold hard cash, drawn from the markets in the European world and their colonies. By 1800, enough silver was making its way into China to merit describing China as the silver graveyard of the world. But by 1830, the maths would change, as Europeans finally found a product that could sell well in China. And that product was opium.
Opium is similar in effect to heroin or morphine today, and was produced from poppy crops. The poppies, which are tall plants with a red flower, were harvested from fields in India and taken to a warehouse where the opium gum was then extracted. It was dried, laid out in trays and pressed into cakes, which looked something like cannonballs, and then they were coated with dried poppy stems and leaves. The drug was not unknown in China and had actually been used as a medicine for things like pain relief.
Yeah, when we were going through the reading for this episode, we found that opium was being used for pretty much every issue.
Yeah, any ailment you could imagine, just give them opium.
Yeah, so I don't know, even your kids, like if your kid can't sleep, opium.
Opium, yeah. Got a little bit of a sore stomach, have some opium.
It's opium.
Yeah. Even things like anything from sore stomach to malaria, just give them a bit of opium.
That was pretty much. But then eventually it grew into something. It grew to include partying as well. And once it became an item for partying in China, that's when it became a problem for Chinese society and a huge opportunity for British merchants.
Yeah, it was the 18th century party drug.
That's what was going on.
Yeah. With the import of tobacco from the New World, opium became more of a recreational drug that was very popular. So opium had actually been illegal in China since the 18th century. The drug was and is highly addictive and became more and more popular in Chinese society as the 19th century developed, reverberating into Chinese society, affecting millions of people, with what I can only imagine are results not completely foreign to the modern consequences of drug addiction.
The mechanism for getting opium into China and how that helped the British pay for tea is a bit complicated. It went something like this. The East India Company could not directly trade in the drug. This was because if it did, it would lose its license to trade in Canton officially because opium is illegal in China. So what were known as private merchants took responsibility for steering the opium trade. Private merchants were individuals who had been granted a visa by the East India Company to trade in Asia. These individuals grouped their investments together into what were called agency houses, through which they did their work. James Matheson, who we mentioned earlier, worked through one of these organizations. The impact of the private agency houses, working with the permission of the East India Company monopoly, was substantial in that they solved the problem of selling a product which the Chinese actually wanted. Between 1800 and 1810, British trade was in deficit to China, using silver to pay for Chinese products they couldn't otherwise pay for with their own goods. The sale of opium by the agency houses changed this. Between 1828 and 1836, the situation had totally reversed. It was the Chinese economy that was now paying in coin to access British products. At the heart of this change was a booming trade in opium. So we can see in the aggregate stats for opium sales, we can see that they explode. So from 1800 to 1821, we have average annual sales of about 4,500 cases of opium per annum. Then we move forward, 1821 to 1831, 10,000 cases per annum on average are being sold. And then we move into the period between 1838, just across a year, to 1839, where we have 40,000 cases being sold. And so it's within this boom that the balance of payment situation completely reverses from a situation where the British are paying out tons of cash to buy silk and tea to a situation where the Chinese are paying out tons of cash to access opium.
It's within stats like these that the two Scots, William Jardine and James Matheson, developed their business, which they creatively named Jardine Matheson & Co. The company they established became one of the largest trading companies in the China trade and, as the 19th century progressed, in the world. They're actually still trading today under Jardine Matheson Holdings, and it actually still carries a thistle on its modern logo as well. The firm succeeded through a mix of political lobbying, excellent business strategy, and an ability to react to the market changes and invest accordingly.
The strategies used by agency houses to sell their opium would change across the early decades of the 19th century. In 1800, the process was more straightforward, concentrating around Canton. 30 years later, as the trade evolved, opium cargoes were being delivered across the coastline of China directly. The earlier strategy went something like this. Delivering opium alongside cotton at the factories in Canton wasn't something the local mandarins could easily ignore. And so European merchants plugged their opium into a large domestic black market, manned by characters like thousands of small-scale Chinese merchants, known as shopmen, and by forces like gangs of pirates. One of these groups was called the Tanka Pirates. In Canton, arrangements would be made with local Chinese opium buyers to meet downriver from Canton, a common spot being an island in the middle of the Pearl River estuary, called Linton. At Linton, a western storage ship was stationed, which was supplied by faster craft arriving from India. Chinese ships, known as fast crabs and scrambling dragons, would pull up alongside the storage ships and exchange Chinese coin for chests of opium. This was the typical business model until the available supply of opium went through the roof as more and more opium crops were grown in India. The effect of the boom in opium production was to make the usual entry sites like Linton flush with options for Chinese buyers looking for the best price. And so local agency houses started to innovate to find the best price for their stocks. James Matheson was one of the first merchants to seek out access to the Chinese markets directly, instead of depending on the usual Chinese intermediaries in Canton.
The new supply strategy involved stocking ships with opium and sailing northeast along the Chinese coast, scanning for opportunities to actually sell the drug. The journal of James Innes, a Scot who was known by his colleagues as the Laird, is an entertaining account of working in the coastal opium trade. So he recounts a journey in 1832 from Chinchu to Fuchao on one of James Matheson's ships. Quote, I have every resource that prudence and wealth can get together. I have always considered it to be a wise measure of those engaged in large affairs to provide for the perfect personal comfort of their agents, so as to keep their temper and mind free for thought and action. I have never before now, in a selfish point of view, experienced the realization of this principle. End quote. So he actually gives us a first-hand account as well as how an opium trade would have gone down. Quote, last night, 2 regular smugglers came off, and after a hard set price, they this day paid $870 a chest and took away 36 chests. Before they were away, 2 more boats came and took away 40 chests at the same price. End quote. He also gives an insight about how crews on the ships would actually spend their free time as well. Quote, we kept St. Andrew's Day yesterday very merrily. The 5 in the captains were, strange to say, all sons of the saint, and what is more curious, 4 of the 5 were from one of Scotland's counties. What's cool about this last quote is it reinforces just how many Scots were actually involved in the opium trade in China.
Yeah, it's like it wasn't prearranged that these guys were going to meet.
Mm.
You know, they all ended up out in Asia, and just by chance, seemingly, they all end up on the same ship, working together. And then 4 of them were from the same county in Scotland. He didn't say, which connects with what we were saying earlier about how family connections were an important part of how somebody could end up working in the trade.
Mm.
In his journal, we hear some of the more mundane aspects of his life as well, of his time while he was in China. So we have December 2nd, quote, employed delivering briskly. No time to read my Bible or to keep my journal. And then later in December 5th, quote, still delivering briskly. Today several small Mandarin junks sailed around us once or twice when some smuggling boats were alongside. They gave us no trouble, and the opium came and went easily close to them. And so to say again, the Mandarins are kind of like they're like the fuzz. They're the police. They're supposed to be upholding like imperial law, but in this situation, the Mandarins kind of like they don't take action and like pull them up about it. This sort of like weaving around the rules in China was something that turned up a lot in the opium trade, and not only just Chinese rules. There was also to do with like the European rules. So you had like the East India Company. They could regulate the activities of British merchants. And if British merchants didn't like East India Company regulations, there were some strategies you could get around it. One of the strategies was to take citizenship from a different country. So there was one situation where the East India Company wanted to eject a British merchant. They said, right, okay, we're withdrawing your visa. You have to go home now. And what he did was he took up citizenship, I think, as like a Dutchman. And so he just turned up later in his boat and then had a Dutch flag and nobody could touch him. And that's something that's like, because I lived in China for a while, and that's something that's still the case. Like in China, weaving around the rules is something that people still get up to. So you have guys who, you call it like a visa run. People stay and they work in China even after their visa has expired. Some people, I met a guy who'd done it for like 2 years. He just lived there. Nobody bugged him. I met another guy whose visa was expiring, and the authorities were aware of this, and so he needed to fly to Hong Kong. He had 20 days to fly to Hong Kong, get all his paperwork sorted, or he was going to be kicked out of the country. So yeah, some things never change. Okay, so now we'll recalibrate right back to Scotland and think about, well, what was the impact on Scotland directly? It's interesting to think about how this affected domestic life in Scotland. Relatively speaking, the numbers involved are lower when compared to Scotland's relationships with Europe and North America. The China trade would have been a potential route for ambition in 1800, but relatively few took that path. The total number of immigrants to the East Asian trade and empire around the early 19th century was just in the thousands, with only around 300 Scots merchants operating around Canton and the East Indies generally at any one time. The young men making the move to China were on a mission to build careers, not settle permanently. So they weren't bringing their families, they weren't bringing extended family with them in the same way that entire families were moving to, say, Canada. So to your average guy in Scotland in 1800, it is to North America or to South Africa that you would look to as a potential destination for building a new life. So while relevant, China wasn't practical for most people.
It isn't obvious how the work itself of guys like James Innes, William Jardine, and James Matheson made an impact on Scotland directly, but the South Asia trade did make waves in Scotland itself. There were job posts and demand for Scottish manufacturers, enough to be relevant in the Scottish economic story, but not on a scale seen in North America, the Empire, and in Europe. The most obvious physical impact was caused by repatriated fortunes brought back to Scotland by guys who had been successful. So we find when James Matheson returned to Scotland in 1844, he just decided to buy the Isle of Lewis. He just went in and he bought the entire island.
And that might seem like you might imagine like a little tiny island.
Yeah.
But the island he bought is enormous.
It's about roughly 700 square mile.
Yeah. So if you were to look at a map of Scotland on the top left, the most northern Ireland, the most northern island of the Hebrides, that's the island. We recommend go on Wikipedia right now and look at it.
Yeah.
Look up the Isle of Lewis. You'll see how big this place is. It's absurd.
Yeah. When I first saw it, I was like, oh, okay, he bought an island, must be quite small. I'm thinking estate size. Because a lot of these guys came back. You came back and you invested in land. You bought an estate. That's what you did. No, this guy he bought a whole island.
Yeah.
£500,000. That's the price tag they'd put on it. Yeah. So this is serious money, serious bling. So he had Lewis. So he started to build Lewis Castle there as his home. That was his new estate. But what he actually did as well was he improved the lives of the other people who lived in the island as well, because he was funding infrastructure as well. So he was building port facilities, he was improving drainage, he was building roads, stuff like that. And he also helped about 2,000 people
immigrate / be evicted.
Yeah, we weren't too sure on this one. It comes across as emigrated.
Yeah.
We're not sure if they were kicked out by him or whether he just maybe they were better off in the mainland. Maybe set them up nicer.
Well, we're not. You gotta do the research.
Yeah.
So that's maybe a crossroads. I don't know how to describe it, but like there's definitely. I'm sure there's two stories here. Matheson, the bad guy evicting the tenants. Matheson, the improver, bringing money and building infrastructure and aiding people pursue a better life. So there's a gray area there. We haven't decided. We just know that there is a gray area.
Yeah. I mean, to be honest, regardless of which way you look at it, he's still today in Lewis. You still have the roads, the old ports, all this stuff. It's still directly linked with the China trades in tea and opium.
Yeah, and it's a cool sort of thread with a direct physical thread, an obvious direct physical thread, linking Scotland back to the China trade.
Yeah, and if you go to Lewis Castle now, it's actually a museum now. It's been converted into a museum for historic Scotland, so you can actually go and visit the house now. So if you're ever in Lewis, go check it out. Yeah.
So yeah, okay. So welcome to the end of the podcast. We're going to talk about some of the sources that we used to explore the subject and to build this episode. So what were the books you explored?
First of all, it was Jardine Matheson, Traders of the Far East by Robert Blake, which was a really good history of the firm Jardine Matheson. Had a lot in the backgrounds of the characters. These are really two interesting guys. Quite different. The impression I got was they're quite different personality-wise. So definitely go check that book out. Read into the characters.
Yeah,
some really good stuff.
Jardine Matheson, Traders of the Far East, Robert Blake.
Yeah.
Although I think it's like $70 on Amazon, so probably not practical.
Yeah.
We got it from the library, so maybe it's at your library. And then there was this book. This is excellent book, The Thistle and the Jade, and it's edited by Maggie Keswick, and there's a bunch of other contributors. And the copy I've got is just so excellently illustrated. There's all these fantastic pictures about what the trade was like, what Canton was like. And it's basically, I think it's like a business history of Jardine Matheson, the company. Because again, this is like a reflection of how massive a success the business was, but it's also a reflection of the awareness of how this is like a kind of Scottish adventure. Jardine Matheson.
Yeah. Another really good one was the Opium War by Julia Lavelle. Now, while we didn't actually touch on the Opium War at all, The first bit of the book was really good for the background, actually leading up. So obviously the trade in Canton, the Canton system, all that kind of stuff. If you're interested, I mean, the Opium War is really interesting as well. We could do a whole another episode on that.
We had to decide like how much Opium War do we have,
Yeah,
and then we ended up deciding the answer is none.
None at all. Yeah, we couldn't
to focus on the.
We couldn't fit it. Yeah, we couldn't fit it in. We couldn't fit it into this episode, unfortunately. But definitely check it out. It's better price range than the others, about £8-9. You'll be able to find it in Waterstones. That's why I picked it up. So definitely go check that out. Really good. It's again like Thistle and Jade. It's got really nice pictures in the middle, so you can actually visualize Canton. You can see the ships there. It's great. And that goes into the Opium War, the first, the second, all that kind of stuff. So definitely check that one out too.
Okay, so that's it for this episode of the Scottish History Podcast.
Yeah, well, we hope you enjoyed listening.
That episode was certainly fun researching, and we hope you enjoyed listening to it.